Hi guys, I hope you enjoy this behind the scenes look at how I make my isometric room illustrations. I use the Procreate app on my iPad, but you can apply most of these basic techniques whatever program you're using. The only thing I don't know about is, what I like about Procreate is it has isometric guides that I have turned on. You can kind of see them faintly in the video, but they allow you to turn on the feature called Drawing Assist, and any line you draw when that option is turned on will snap to your guides. So I don't have to do anything special to get all these shapes to look correct. I'm sure there are ways to do it in other programs. I don't know how, but if you Google isometric drawing tools, tips or something in the name of your program, I'm sure you'll find options. Procreate just makes it really easy. So I start off by sketching with the Narrander pencil. I like it because it's fairly mono width, so you don't get a lot of tapering or variation. I like to create new layers for each object I'm drawing, so I have separate ones for the different tables, and I'm making a new one now for the panels on the wall. And I do that so I can move them around freely, kind of like you would in like a drag and drop room decorating game or something, and this just allows me to reposition things as I want without having to take the extra step of drawing around it with the lasso and select it and move it. So that's all fairly straightforward with these shapes, but here I have to draw the quilt on the wall, and that's going to be a pain to draw with the isometric guides on. So I'm switching to a 2D grid guide and drawing the quilt as if it's just a flat object in front of me. I'm not putting any perspective on it at all. And once I have that finished quilt, then what I can do is use the distort tool and warp it onto the wall so it looks like it is in the right environment. So at this point I've run into a problem and I'm realizing this table is too wide, but if I just scale it, it's not going to look right. So what you can do is use your lasso and grab half of it and shift it so you can basically just make it skinnier and then redraw any details where they get squished and messed up. Now it's time to draw Mabel and Sable. I wish I had some special tricks for drawing the actual characters in these rooms, but you just gotta figure it out and struggle through it. It takes some practice, but once you've done a few rooms, you kind of have a feel for the general angle that they're gonna be at, and it gets easier over time. And one thing I want to point out at this stage is I like sketching just the basics of the furniture and the characters before I start getting into any smaller objects and details. Because as you can see, Sable's pretty big, and had I drawn all the details on the table behind her first, it would have been for nothing because they got mostly covered up and all you see is like part of a pincushion and some books. So don't do what I used to do, draw all the details, and then find out that nobody can see them thanks to your big fat character sitting in the way. Here's where I use a tool that I've shared with you before, but this is a newer version of it. These are isometric circle stamps I've basically made, where they're like the 3 circles from the previous tool I shared that was a cube, but these are just the circles, and so I can stamp them into place and it gives me the shape of like a round frame or a clock at that angle without having to, you know, sit there and sketch this odd squished circle. I can just stamp it and use that as a starting point. One thing you'll see me doing a lot in this next little section is copying, pasting sketches. Don't make things hard for yourselves, kids. I mean, if you sketched a dress form with a t-shirt, you don't need to draw it again. Just copy paste it and change what needs to be changed, make it sleeveless, draw a duck on it. Don't redraw the whole thing and waste time. Now this sketching is pretty much done and it's time to do the line art. I use a set of modified Narrander pencils for all my line art, and I have little variations on them, different sizes, different thicknesses, and I use them for pretty much everything. They're my favorite. You might notice that the sketches look washed out, and that's because I put a white fill layer over them and reduce the opacity on that, and that's just to make them less prominent so I can focus on my line art and only have enough sketch there to be able to trace it. And as with my sketches, I don't do my line art all on one layer. It's not as many layers as the sketches, but it's generally broken up into like the details on the wall and floor, the characters and different sections of the furniture, just so I can recolor line art as I want to at the end without having to worry about changing the entire thing at once. Since the line art's fairly straightforward, as is laying in the base color, I'm just going to skip that because it's very boring, and we'll get to shading. There is one little trick you can do to make filling in base color and shading easier when you have your line art split onto multiple layers, and that is to take your folder containing all of your line art and duplicate it. So see, like that was a different layer for Mabel there. I'm copying the entire folder, and now I'm going to condense it all into one layer. So I have this duplicate layer that's all the line art on one thing, and I'm going to set that layer as the reference layer, and I'm going to just make it invisible. So I'm turning that layer off, it's there and it's set as the reference, and that will enable me to fill in color on Procreate, even though all my actual visible line art is split into multiple layers. So for shading, I start off by creating a couple layers. I usually have 1 or 2 layers for shadows, so I'll just name them Shadow 1, Shadow 2, set them to multiply. I usually start off somewhere around 40% opacity, and I'll tweak it as needed to get to where I want. And then I'll create another layer that is named Highlight, and that's usually a screen layer somewhere around 40% opacity to start with as well. For shading, I do have some specific colors I like to use. Those top 3 purples are generally my most commonly used shadows. I do have some more brownish red colors that I use on typically on things that are made of wood, because they'll tend to look kind of muddy if I use the purple. But yeah, just try different colors. Don't use black at all. Actually, it'll just make the colors look really gross. But anyway, on those shadow layers, I'll turn on drawing assist, I'll turn it off like sometimes, and I'm just drawing in where I think there's obvious shadows, usually underneath tables and stuff first. There's usually a window or some other kind of light source I have in mind, so I'll put shadows on the far side of objects, So like on the ends of tables and things that are facing away from the window. When you're shading, don't feel like you have to get it right the first time. Don't feel pressure about making everything perfect, because guess what? Sometimes you try stuff and you're like, oh wait, that looks terrible. So you can erase shit, you can change it. Like as you can see here, I'm like trying different colors, and you'll eventually see that I'm like, thanks, I hate it, and I just start over. If I'm having trouble finding the right color for a shadow or a highlight, one good trick to do is just take an eyedropper tool and copy the color that you're shading on top of and use the same color as a shadow or highlight, and it will usually come out looking relatively okay. If you need to go darker, just make the color a little bit darker. If you need to go paler, go a little bit paler. Another thing you can do if you're struggling with your shadows not looking quite right is don't do a shadow. Why don't you try to emphasize the shape by using highlights instead? You can use highlights to give an object shape just the same exact way. It's just the opposite of a shadow, and it can be just as effective. When it comes to shadows though, I generally try to have a deep shadow, a mid shadow, and a light shadow. So for the purples, there's a medium purple, there's a pale purple, and then there's the darkest purple, which I use the most. But don't just have one flat color that you use across the board, otherwise things won't have as much depth. You don't need to go crazy and have like a million levels of shadows, but just having a deep, a mid, and a light will really help bring a lot of depth to your piece. Now this is around the time that the piece is usually wrapping up, and one last thing I like to do is I take a note of the line art color, and sometimes things are drawing too much attention when they don't really need to be. So for example here on the wall panels, it just felt like they looked rather harsh with the dark brown lines, so I just selected the color of the panels, went a bit darker, and replaced the color of the line art. And this is a perfect example of why I like to keep my line art on separate layers, because I started off drawing in the new color, and then I was like, oh wait, I have it all in a different layer, I'll just fill it and be done with it. The way you can do that is you take the layer that you want to change the line art color of, you turn on alpha lock, and then it locks the transparency, and the only thing that you can change the color of or draw on is stuff that's already in existence. If I had everything on one layer, I would have to painstakingly be careful to only color in the areas that I want to, and I'm impatient, I don't like doing it. Now that most of the highlights and shadows are taken care of, it's time to do the light that's coming up with the window. I just generally refer to this as atmospheric lighting, and I don't have a super set approach to it. It's usually a lot of experimentation, and it involves using the soft airbrush and usually setting the layers to add, screen, and some combination of a couple of them to get what I want. And I just want to point out, it's important to put this layer above your liner. Otherwise, everything, all the colors will look like there is light coming across it, but then you'll have this super dark line art that is unaffected and it looks extremely unnatural. So make sure it's on top of everything. So I just generally block in some color and I try to feather it out towards the end. And the reason I'm like stopping kind of short here is because if you think about it logically, the light would not extend that far because it's hitting the table, and then it wouldn't quite reach the floor behind it, and it wouldn't hit Mabel, who is too far out of range from it. So what I'm doing here is you just see me like flipping through different blending modes of the layer, going back and forth, and ultimately I end up picking add, and I reduce the layer opacity quite a bit. And my preferred way to clean this whole thing up is, instead of to erase it, which I initially started doing and then I remembered, I like to put a mask over it, because that way I can restore parts of this light if I find it looks better, whereas I don't have to like sit there and redraw things. I can just put it there, take it back, put it there, take it back. I'll usually make another additive layer and just do some thinner rays of light that come in. It gives it a little more dimension. Looks a lot cuter. And after that, it's pretty much just cleanup, erasing it from areas I don't want it to be, and adding it, tapping in some light where I do want it. Sometimes I also play with the color of the light itself. I initially put it in as a bright yellow, but it looked kind of weird, so I started messing around and experimenting with colors, and ultimately I just thought white looked the most correct for what it should be. Just a little bit more touch-up of line art recoloring, and that's pretty much it. Add my watermark, because people like to steal shit, and that is it. So I hope this was helpful, even if it wasn't a super in detail tutorial. I didn't want to focus specifically on Procreate since I know not everyone uses it, but hopefully this has given you some tricks and different approaches that you hadn't thought about before. Thanks, bye!